By the way, when I do my intense research for this podcast, I just put your name into Google. That's a lot of the research. And I'm curious, are you familiar with the Jessica-Polka?
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
I didn't know how obvious that was.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I can't really I can't say that it's my favorite tune or that I've like paid much attention to it over but I know that it exists. So
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I was just curious because I thought maybe it's just because I'm in Germany and like the one thing that was shown to me was like a German brass band. So I thought like, oh, maybe that's...
Oh, no. It's here too. It's here too as well. I'm sort of glad that Google didn't exist when I was like in elementary school, because I'm sure that would have caused even more merciless teasing.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those things that can... one of those coincidences that can really make a tough childhood, but...
It's fine. I had some very, enlightened schoolmates, so it wasn't too bad.
That's good. Anyway, we're not, not here to talk about various music or songs. Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll be talking mainly about kind of, scientific dissemination and evaluation, assessment, all this kind of stuff. Maybe, I'll start very classically. I believe, when you work, right, full-time for ASAPbio.
That's correct.
What is ASAPbio? What do you do? Maybe, I don't know, it's a company or what exactly you would call it, but the organization in general and you in particular.
Yeah, ASAPbio is a small nonprofit organization. We are based in the United States, but we are concerned really with preprint adoption and the use of open peer review throughout the world. So we began really as a meeting in 2016. When Ron Vale recruited me and a few other biologists to help him organize a conference about the use of preprints in basic life sciences. So from there, we have grown into an organization that tries to promote community champions in preprint review. And we try to do this through several different kind of theories of change. One is that people begin to change the way that they publish based upon seeing their colleagues and their friends do it. And so what we have tried to do is create a way for people who are willing to change something about how they disseminate their science to find each other, gain support, gain the resources and the information that they need in order to have conversations with their co-authors, with their colleagues about posting preprints, about using open feedback and open peer review. And, we also do a variety of other things. We, of course, assemble these resources. We run some pilots. I think the most significant among them was partnering with EMBO to launch Review Commons, which is a journal independent peer review project. But I think a major activity continues to be convening groups of people together, groups of stakeholders, for all the way from people who are very involved in the technical infrastructure of preprint and open peer review publishing, to researchers themselves, to people in societies, to journal editors and publishers. So really through those mechanisms of advocacy, community building, convening, resource building, and pilot projects, we are trying to move the needle a little bit in the biology community.
Mm-hmm. Before we started recording, we talked a little bit about the interview you did on Everything Hurts with Dan Quintana and James Heathers. And, this was something like 5 years ago. And you talked about preprints and how especially in biology, they weren't quite as accepted as, well, maybe they were in psychology, but also just not as accepted as you'd like them to be. In psychology, it feels like pretty much everything is preprinted now, although I did interestingly have two people who published in Nature who were interviewed like half a year before, and I didn't know about their preprints. So maybe when people submit to Nature, they don't preprint it. I don't know. And maybe that's some sort of something, maybe that's an interesting data point in itself. But I'm curious, like, how do you still need today to convince people in biology that they should preprint, or has that kind of changed a lot in the last few years?
I think that over the past few years, many more people know what a preprint is, and they're aware of preprinting, and maybe have even posted a preprint. but I don't think that we're anything close to ubiquitous use of preprints in biology. So I think over the past years, there's been a lot of really positive change in how preprints are accepted. For example, preprints are now indexed in PubMed Central for works that were funded by NIH. So I think that that's a big help to the visibility of these preprints funded by this U.S. government agency, and really helps to legitimize them. But Europe PMC, which is the European mirror of PubMed Central, indexes a huge swath, I would say almost all of the biomedical preprints. And by comparing their volume to the volume of all publications on PubMed, the volume of preprints is still only about 10% per month at a maximum. So there's 90% of the literature in the life sciences more broadly, the biomedical literature, is not being preprinted. Now, of course, you can't really make a one-to-one comparison there because some preprints don't go on to become papers, which is, I think, a good thing. But it speaks to the fact that I think there is more work to be done around not only awareness, because I do think that the pandemic and preprints and COVID-19 really helped raise awareness of the fact that they exist. And people looked at preprints, certainly, to maybe, even if it was a COVID-related preprint, I think people are more aware of preprints now. But I think the main issue is that something that you alluded to, where people may still fear that preprinting will harm the perception of novelty of their work when submitting to a journal, or it may create problems relating to scooping or being scooped by their colleagues. So I think that these fears still exist, and that the institutional recognition for preprinting or the perception of preprints hasn't really caught up to really give all researchers the incentives that they need to post them.
Yeah, so that's still the case that people, I don't know, maybe it's difficult because let's put it this way, like I guess I got my bachelor's once the kind of whole reproducibility movement was really full on strike in psychology, so it's maybe a little bit hard to imagine. But for me it feels like, it's basically always been the way that people use preprints all the time and no one cares about it. Although, I mean, I did have one, talking about the kind of perception of preprints, I did have one kind of really weird thing that genuinely shocked me in peer reviewing an article where I was the reviewer, and someone they said, like, I don't know, we are the first people to do X, but they said something like, there's not much that's been done here, and I said, like, well, here's 3 preprints. That did, like, you can't really make that claim. Here's 3 from the last year, right? And they actually then, I thought they would just go like, oh yeah, thank you very much, we've included them in the article now. But then they said, no, we're not going to include preprints. We're not going to cite preprints in our final manuscript. And the reason they gave was because we want to respect the work that reviewers put into reviewing peer-reviewed articles. Something really weird. But I'm curious, is that a common thing that people just don't want to cite preprints at all because they still see them as prelim? I mean, sorry. Also, my argument was then, like, you are a peer, review it. Now it's peer. Like, you're 2 authors. You can just make a judgment of whether this paper is worth to be included or not. Then it's peer reviewed, right? I mean, it's also from your field. It's not like this is like some completely out of field thing. But is that common? I don't have that much experience with peer review and preprints and that kind of stuff.
I definitely think that it is. I to my knowledge, I'm not sure of any work looking at whether preprints are undercited systemically because of things like this, but certainly we hear complaints from researchers also that less in the last couple of years, but that journals are not allowing them to include citations or requesting that they remove citations to preprints, which is, in my view, kind of outrageous. It's plagiarism is a very strong word, but to take the idea that there may have been information that is useful in a reference, and then to force authors to remove that reference or to neglect to include a reference that is actually useful to you, that seems like a pretty bad way to represent and share scholarship. But what you're describing of researchers just simply not wanting to look at preprints seems also equally strange to me. Would you not go to a conference and listen to a talk or go to a poster that's representing something unpublished. It's confusing. I think it's an example of how our current system for information management in much of scholarship, which is to sort of rely on peer reviewers and editors to create a absolute unidimensional, really binary metric of trust. If something is published and peer reviewed, then it's kind of accepted that it's trustworthy, which of course we all know to be based upon the incidence of retractions, to be not necessarily a great strategy. But I think that it's an example of a time when that way of thinking has to be challenged a little bit. And so it's not surprising to me that some of these growing pains exist.
Yeah. I mean, also, I don't know how well you can comment on this, because I guess I'm curious, like, what the difference is between different fields, because it seems to me that from what I hear, mathematics has a lot of stuff that is just on archive and that's kind of it. I don't know whether that's true. It's just a rumor. I don't know. But I definitely know that, for example, in economics, they have a very different, which is a field I sometimes read papers from. They have a very kind of different field because they have these papers that also take years to come out. So to allow PhD students and kind of early career researchers to have something to show, they have working papers. So they have these like kind of working papers that they put out there that are basically preprints. It has a different, I don't know the economics word exactly. Seems to have some, not exactly the same status as a preprint. But I'm curious, like, is biology like one of the later sciences to accept this kind of thing, or is my view just skewed because I happen to know, the stuff that I know happen to be fields that very heavily use them already?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that biology is late to the game, although there was a really interesting experiment in the 1960s where the NIH ran an experiment called information exchange groups, where they literally had people mail in papers. They photocopied them, then mailed them back out. So I do think that it's not necessarily that biologists we're never going to move in this direction, but I do think that certain practices and policies, namely the Inglefinger rule at the New England Journal of Medicine, really chilled the willingness to share information in a format that is approaching a preprint for several decades.
Sorry, what is that rule?
The Inglefinger rule was instituted by an editor of the same name who basically suggested that medical research should only be published once, that in order to keep the literature comprehensible and clean, there should not be duplicate publication. And so this rule, which has become kind of assumed practice in much of at least the biomedical literature, has, I think, precluded preprints from being accepted, because I think there's a little bit of an assumption that it is duplicate publication. I think that there's a question as to whether you characterize preprints as duplicate publication or as more akin to a conference presentation where people are sharing. I think once you press publishers and editors, I don't think that anybody wants to prevent researchers from talking to one another. The question is really how similar the preprint is to the work that's going to appear in the journal eventually.
In a way, I like the rule to like keep everything, to keep the number of publications from exploding so much. But yeah, I mean, I see where it comes from. But the weird thing, because the preprint is obviously going to differ from the final product. But at least the way, I don't know, maybe this is a question, how people use preprints, because I actually use them as, here's the thing that I wanted to write. And then it gets changed afterwards through peer review. Often you learn stuff because, obviously peer reviewers point things out. But for me, the preprint is supposed to be basically an article. Is that actually how it's usually used, or are there uses for preprints? I actually never considered that people might do things differently than I do.
Yeah, I do think that the majority in various surveys, at least in biomedicine, I think people are typically posting the preprint around the time of submission to a journal. But that doesn't mean that people can't post preprints that they never intend to submit to a journal, or that they can't use preprints for sharing of information that is not going to be typically welcomed by the journal process. For example, earlier this year, we ran a competition for preprints containing negative data. So can preprints be a vehicle for sharing negative results that change the equation a little bit? I think, perhaps for a researcher, if you're sitting on some data that are not going to make a huge splash, it may not be appealing to go through a process of trying to convince a journal it's worth publishing, getting peer reviewed, doing the revisions. Whereas I do think it is important for the community to just kind of get it out there. Do the incentives line up to encourage everyone to use preprints in this fashion right now? No, but I do think that it's something that should be done more in a more widespread way.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, yeah. I have an article right now that's just taking for ages to get published, and at some point you go like, is it worth the effort? It's already a preprint, but
Yeah, not only that, but I think being able to put in the effort is a huge privilege in a sense. There was a really interesting preprint that came out earlier this year, I believe, called Preprint Match, which was describing a tool to identify matches between journal articles and preprints. And they used it to identify additional preprint journal article links beyond what is simply reported in preprint servers or Crossref. And they use this information to look at country-specific rates of conversion of a preprint into a journal article. So in wealthy countries, in Europe and in North America, for example, something like 60 or 70% of preprints eventually become journal articles. But in low and middle income countries, that number is closer to 40%. And there's also a relationship between whether the researchers have external funding or not. And in those contexts, the time window between preprinting and the immersion of this final article, or the emergence of that final article, is a shorter time window. And there's more changes in author list between the two. So it's almost as though in order to take a paper from submission at a journal all the way to publication at a journal, you need to have people staying in the research group long enough to complete the experiments, to respond to reviewers. You probably need to have some funding to, conduct the additional work, to say nothing of publication charges or anything that might be associated with that, any costs associated with publishing. So, right, I think that preprints from that lens are really allowing more work to emerge than would if we had only the traditional journal system.
That's really interesting. I never thought about that. I guess that's the whole, benefit of the internet, right? That basically anyone with a connection can share things, and you don't need, access to X or Y or all these other things. I have a brief question about preprints, in the sense that one of the advantages of preprints that's often mentioned as one of the main ones is that you can, I guess there's like two main advantages of preprints that I'd like to question a little bit and see kind of what you think about my potential objections. I mean, one is kind of that people say often that preprints are great because you can get feedback before you publish, right? You put your preprint out there, people comment on it there, and then you go like, oh, thank you very much, here's an error, I fixed it, you submit it, and then it's, the final product's better. I've never had anyone really comment usefully on any of my preprints. I mean, part of that is because it's probably me and the lab I was in and the people I know are not huge on social media. So like I can mail, I've mailed people my basically manuscript in that sense, and then they've given me useful feedback. But like I don't have the kind of social media following that loads of people will necessarily read it after that and actually comment on it. So for me, it feels like it's a kind of one of those uses that might happen, but not really, at least not in my experience. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because I completely agree with you that in a perfect world, everybody would be getting really constructive feedback on their preprint. They would be making connections with new colleagues that weren't aware of their work. They would be starting collaborations. But I do think that this vision is limited by a couple of different things. The first being that right now, attention on preprints, I don't think we've really figured out how to give the right preprints our attention. As you mentioned social media. There's a lot of use of the network formerly known as Twitter and other social media tools to share preprints. And I think that that's fantastic, but it can also create this deluge of information. And I have spoken to many researchers who mention using the table of contents of journals as a way to identify work that they want to read. And, that clearly you can get a table of contents for a subject matter collection at a preprint server, for example, but it's going to be enormous. It's not going to be filtered. Clearly, I think that there's a lot of work being done in tools to recommend papers, in search for specific keywords, following certain authors. I think there's a lot to be done in this space. But the more significant barrier, in my view, to public commenting on preprints, because, as you mentioned, it's just not that common. On bioRxiv, for example, I think between 5 and 10% of preprints have a public comment. But according to a survey done by bioRxiv, the number of authors who received feedback privately is much higher than that. I think something, several times higher, certainly. And that feedback can come in several ways. And I do think that people are receiving those benefits, but the benefits to the community are really limited because it's not being shared publicly where others can see it, where it's effectively changing norms about sharing opinions about papers publicly. At ASAPbio, we've tried a couple of different experiments to help reduce the energy barrier to posting a public comment, because obviously it's completely understandable that especially early career researchers might feel some hesitance in posting a comment publicly, especially if it creates some kind of critical comment that creates an awkward situation for the authors and the commenters. So what we've done is launched an initiative called Crowd Preprint Review, which is based off of a type of review initiated by the synthetic chemistry journal Synlit, in which a pool of of reviewers are commenting on a paper all together. And then those comments get synthesized into a single review that gets posted publicly. But the synthesis enables the individual reviewers to be anonymized. It enables them to kind of comment and cross-comment on one another, to correct or to provide feedback on the commentary so that it becomes a bit more robust. I think that for researchers right now, there's so many invitations to peer review things getting sent around, though perhaps not necessarily to the people who have time to actually do it. And as a result, it can be kind of burdensome to imagine leaving an unsolicited review or an unsolicited comment on a preprint. So I think that there's a variety of initiatives now that are trying to use some kind of coordinator, a community coordinator, just to kind of stimulate this type of feedback and review. And I think that's what needs to happen in order to enable feedback at a large scale.
Has that already happened a few times, or is that still in the making, that scheme?
Yeah, so Crowd Review, we've run it for 3 years now with various different permutations. But I think the most significant source of preprint review is actually from the journal eLife, which has now shifted to a model in which, rather than providing an accept-reject decision, they are posting manuscripts that have been reviewed along with the reviewer's comments and an editorial summary, which allows the authors to go back and make a revision, get the editorial process, get another editorial evaluation. But I think that is really addressing a lot of the volume that we're seeing. So we have a chart of the volume of preprint reviews per month. And I would say that this has increased over the past few years. If you give me a minute, I can tell you the numbers exactly. But I will say that they have risen from almost non-existent about 6 years ago into, I believe, the hundreds per month now.
I mean, I guess kind of one topic that's been in the background, kind of popping in and out of our conversation, is the idea of peer review as the decision whether to accept the journal or not. Whereas what we're discussing right now is kind of peer review, peer review kind of just to help people, basically just to say like, hey, here's what I like and what I didn't like about your article. Could you maybe outline the kind of the current state of the idea of, peer review with separating peer review from an acceptance to publish in a journal or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Peer review does have multiple functions and it has multiple audiences. As it's used right now, it provides feedback to the authors to help them improve their manuscript. And it also provides some context to the editors and maybe even advice to the editors on whether or not to accept a paper for a journal. But peer review could also have, and does in cases where journals actually publish the peer review reports, a third audience, which is readers of the paper. And I think here it helps to contextualize the paper and maybe provide a little bit of information about the strengths, other considerations, other interpretations. This is something that is not really emphasized, of course, in the journal review process, but I do think it's a strength that can be played up as we experiment with these different forms of preprint review. I think that taking the concept of journal acceptance out of the review process changes the way that reviewers act. I don't think that there's been very rigorous, semantic analysis of the difference between review reports for a journal agnostic review service versus a traditional journal. But what we do have is a survey conducted by Review Commons in the early days after its launch, where authors were asked, if you compare the experience of getting reviews through Review Commons, which are journal agnostic. So basically what happens is that the authors will submit a manuscript to Review Commons. A editor at ASAPbio will assign reviewers, but the reviewers are asked to focus on the science and not evaluate the paper for a specific journal. They send the reviews back to the author, and the author can then take that package of a reviewed paper, which now becomes a reviewed preprint, but also submit it to affiliate journals who agree not to restart the evaluation process. So basically what it is a single round of review that is not going to result in like an editorial decision directly. And so when authors are asked, how do you find this process compared to the more traditional journal process? The majority of the respondents evaluated the Review Commons experience as more constructive and more, I would say, kind of pleasant and collegial. And I think that that's certainly hopeful for addressing some of these issues that we have where you have lots of editorial cartoons. You can probably imagine in your head right now peer review as like a gauntlet where reviewers are swinging maces and axes at this white-coated scientist trying to get to the goal of publication. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Peer review, when it's removed from gatekeeping, I think still has an important role in informing readers about the context of a paper. And certainly there's papers that are very misleading or that can be damaging to public health. And that's a big reason why I think that some of the fields relating more directly to clinical science and medicine are more hesitant to embrace preprinting because the risks, of course, are much higher. But just to say that even if you don't have journal gatekeeping, I think reviewers still have a way to express to readers of the paper that there might be other ways to interpret the information presented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the Review Commons. I mean, it sounds very similar to Peer Review In, which I talked a little bit about with Chris Chambers in the context of register reports, where they have, you submit your register report and then you have people evaluate it, and then I think that then you get an accept or reject, but independent of, there's like 10 journals or whatever who will just take it if it's, if it fits within their topic. It sounds very similar. Are there any kind of interesting differences that maybe highlight different nuances or?
Yeah, so at register reports, as I understand them in the context that you're mentioning, enable researchers to get peer-reviewed for the methods independent of the results. Whereas in Review Commons, a registered report, as I understand it, is conducted, except in the case where you mentioned with peer community, and would be conducted by a specific journal. Whereas I think Review Commons is similar to peer community in that it is a journal independent review process, but typically by the time that a manuscript gets to Review Commons, because the field is really basic biomedical sciences, lots of cell biology, for example, molecular biology, for that reason, it does not resemble a registered report in the sense that it's really like a complete manuscript. But I love the idea of pre-registration. And I think that it's kind of a puzzle, though, to think about how to implement pre-registration in the kind of science that I was doing in my PhD and postdoc, where the time window of experimental iteration is really high. Like, you can have an idea for an experiment, just go into the lab, mix some liquids together, and have the experiment done by the end of the day. So it's challenging to think about that. Although I have heard Brian Nosek from Center for Open Science talk about the idea of integrating registration with a lab notebook. So, the idea that you're kind of registering experiments on a daily basis as you're planning them out. And that, to me, makes a lot of sense, but it also really upends, in a much more fundamental way, the notions of publishing, even compared to what we're talking about now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, asking a little bit about the purpose of preprints, another kind of question I had was kind of what exactly the purpose of a preprint is, if in many cases it feels like, I mean, it's not like a full publication, and often it's only fully accepted once it is a publication. But so maybe what are kind of some of the purposes of preprints if it's often not as accepted as an actual publication?
I think there's two different ways to look at this. One is that you're posting a preprint. On average, according to PubMed Central, or it's about 4 to 5 months prior to the journal publication. So you're posting a preprint some months ahead of when the work is going to get out there. We know from various studies comparing preprints to final published versions that the majority of preprints more or less resemble the journal article. Typically, the sample size might increase, some content might get added or removed, but generally the main conclusions of the paper stand. Although that's not, of course, the case for every single preprint, and there's important conversations to be had around that. But nevertheless, I think, one argument is that you post the preprint, and in that time, you help people in your field gain some knowledge and understanding, begin impacting their own conception of the problem that they're working on, and accelerate the process of discovery and save time for early career researchers and everyone else. Another way of looking at preprinting is that by putting the dissemination first and layering peer review and curation and reputation on top of that, you can create a new form of publishing that breaks apart some of the problematic associations that we have right now with sharing work in journals that create prestige signals. So I think in some ways the process of right now dissemination in a traditional journal is wrapped up really tightly with, of course, peer review, which is an important service that journals provide, but also with the assignment of a certain presumed quality marker to the paper. So even though we've had lots of initiatives like DORA that have made it distasteful in some circles to mention the impact factor, I think that everyone has a reaction to looking at the journal title as a way of understanding what the authors were able and or willing to go through in order to get the paper out. So on some levels, I think it is important that there are quality signifiers. I don't think that it's pragmatic for a human brain to try to comprehend the totality of literature that is being produced on a daily basis. It's simply impossible. Certainly one can do that for your own narrow field, but what happens when you step outside that field and you need to evaluate a potential candidate to be hired or evaluate someone for tenure, or as you go up into this administrative ladder in institutions, and it becomes much more challenging to understand science. And so journal title is really, I think, the shorthand that has been developed as a metric to signify quality. And I think it's a pretty bad way to do that for a number of reasons. First of all, it's collapsing all of the possible quality indicators or significance indicators or rigor indicators into a single word. The evaluation process is done by a relatively small number of people, which becomes more and more challenging the more interdisciplinary the science is. And it also happens very inefficiently. It happens in parallel. So not in parallel, but in series. So for example, you get rejected at one paper you get rejected at one journal, you take your paper to the next journal, you go through another process. And to some extent, there's a endurance contest aspect, which I think is really made clear by that paper that I mentioned earlier, the preprint MASH paper. So I think that the preprints offer an opportunity to rethink publishing. And what I think is great about them is that even though they have this very aspirational, visionary potential, they are also compatible with journals. And so it allows people to engage with a taste of open science, if you will, in a way that is sensitive to their current needs and their current willingness to do so. So for example, somebody may preprint their paper and submit it to a traditional journal. Someone who is feeling, perhaps that their context allows it, might preprint and use one of these preprint review initiatives, especially now that there are some funders and institutions that are recognizing reviewed preprints as kind of evidence of productivity. So there's all kinds of different ways to envision them, but from the perspective of thinking long term, I do think that the opportunity to revisit how we think about peer review, what peer review is, the functions of peer review, and how we think about quality and rigor and significance and all of these abstract things, that's what really excites me the most about preprints.
Do you still think we need journals? Kind of what's your... it's a big question in a way. But I'm curious kind of what you and maybe ASAPbio, whether you have a preferred future model of scientific dissemination that kind of ties together these quality indicators and, some of them maybe necessary curation work that journals do. Do you have a particular suggestion there?
Well, I think that journals are doing really important work in providing peer review and in curation. And I think that work needs to be done in some fashion. I do question whether the current journal publishing workflow is the best way to do that work. I am intrigued by the latest proposal from Coalition S called Towards Responsible Publishing, in which a variety of principles for publishing are laid out, including that authors kind of control the dissemination of their work. So in other words, that they are the ones who decide to publish their paper, to post their paper, and that the peer review process is transparent and open. And kind of putting those things together, you do end up with a preprint and then review model in which authors post their preprints and then various quality control processes can be layered on top of that. And some of these might resemble traditional peer review, where an editor invites reviewers, expert reviewers, maybe where the editor writes a summary, kind of like we see happening in eLife right now. Others might resemble more informal commenting. So there's so many different experiments happening now in preprint review. I think there's been interesting experiments in badging by the American Society for Cell Biology, Plaudit, which is like literally just a button that you click that indicates if you find a paper interesting, you log into it with your ORCID. There's like AI-driven review or, automated checks for compliance with checklists, with data availability. So the concept of evaluation right now is, everything that is kind of collapsed into this single trusted stamp of approval of a journal title can actually be made transparent, and all of this rich information can, I think, help readers understand on a much more dynamic level. How is this paper viewed? Can I trust the information here? How does it relate to other work in the field? And I think that all of that could be done in a much more dynamic and ongoing way, especially with some emerging technologies For example, I'm thinking about cite.ai, which looks at the context of how a paper is cited by other work. And is it a confirming or does it refute it, et cetera? So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to evaluate papers in different ways and to also create lists, curation, both for readers and for people who are thinking about evaluation in a way that's a lot more nuanced. But in order to do that, I think we need to have some alternative to the traditional journal publishing system, or at least like the permission to kind of layer some of these experiments and evaluation alongside the existing literature.
Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned Plaudit, I was like, I've definitely heard that, and then I remembered, oh yeah, that thing on the top of SciArchive that no one ever uses. I mean, not to shit on the people who did Plaudit, I'm sorry, but
yeah,
I don't know.
You're right. It's like there's a lot of these adoption is not. It's challenging to get adoption started because I think there's a big chicken and egg problem here, where no one, if you don't have a huge user base, it's going to be hard to get meaningful indicators. And if there's no meaningful indicators, then use of that modality is not going to be very high, which is in turn does not promote user base. So I do think that there's an important role for institutions and funders to actually step in and be, I would say, a bit bold about what they want to see in terms of evaluation, because I think that could really help put some gas behind some of these experiments.
Yeah. Why should we publish peer review?
Peer review is such an important aspect of scholarship. It's really making or breaking people's career options. It's kind of what's providing the fuel for our current evaluation system and our trust in science. But the fact that most peer review now is seen by only a few readers is very wasteful, in my opinion. It also, when this review is not shared publicly, it kind of aids in, again, this collapse we've been talking about of over compressing all of the information in the review and evaluation process just down to journal title. So why do we want to lose that information? It can provide insights onto the strengths and the weaknesses of the paper. It can help students who have many times never seen a peer review report until they get their own back on their own paper.
Until they get a rough awakening.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think there's a lot of heterogeneity in peer review reports. And I think that bringing them out into the public and into the open would perhaps inspire people to reconsider, how they do them. That best practices could be better identified. And frankly, I think that it's a step, though not the entire solution, toward rewarding and recognizing reviewers for their efforts. Right now, people's motivation for reviewing, my understanding from the surveys I've seen, seems to be around helping the field, altruism, although probably relationships with editors are not, insignificant as well, right? Yeah. But I think that this is important work, and there's a reviewing crisis. There's not enough, perhaps, acknowledgement of the scholarship, and I think it would be very healthy to do that. And furthermore, I think that hiding all of this review enables behavior that is perhaps not the most collegial and not the most constructive. I think that often talking to people when they say, I write the report as though it's going to be posted or as though I'm going to sign it, even if I'm not. And I should clarify here that I'm not arguing that everyone should sign their reviews. I do think that there's a lot of complications around that. I think what's most important is that the content of the review report actually makes it out there rather than the identity of the reviewer. But all that is to say that I think that if you're writing it for the public audience, it's a little bit less of an opportunity to, one needs to reconsider how they're phrasing things, how they're saying things. And I think that would probably go a long way to making the whole publishing experience more constructive.
Okay. Brief question there. Can actually I, as a peer reviewer, can I just publish my peer reviews of things? Or what's the kind of, I don't want to say legal allow it, but like, I actually don't know like what feels like I just write something and then it, it's given to the journal, but kind of, am I allowed to do that myself, or does the journal have to have a policy? Well, yeah, how does that work?
Absolutely. There's a lot of confusion around this, but reviewers are authors of their peer review reports. And as such, they own the copyright of those reports. And I think that there's a journal confidentiality norms that reviewers are kind of held to not reveal information about a manuscript that is under review. But where there is a preprint, I think it's very constructive for reviewers to post the content of their reviews. And we've had a campaign called Publish Your Reviews to encourage this behavior, because I do think that it would really have all the positive effects we just discussed and reaffirm that reviewers are authors of this scholarship. And by posting it on preprints, I think there's also an opportunity to help stimulate some of this public discussion that I think could be so powerful.
I mean, if peer review comments are published but anonymous, doesn't that kind of defeat some of the purposes, because you can still be an arsehole without anyone knowing it was you? I mean, just some of the, the being more kind of constructive. I mean, if your name isn't associated to it, then basically it's an anonymous like comment board on the internet, right? Apart from the editor knowing.
Yeah, I hear you. I would like to, perhaps I'm being, naive, but, I would hope that people would still, consider the implications for the authors regardless. But I think that there's a couple different ways to potentially create systems where the identity of the reviewer is known to certain parties who may need to have this information. For example, a institution or editors who might be interested in looking at the review work of particular individuals. For example, there could be a system where there's mediated anonymity, where the review is posted in an anonymous way, but the identity is tracked by the system posting the comment. For example, pre-review has a mechanism by which early career researchers can post under a pseudonym, and then later, if they wish, attach their name to the comments, so can kind of unmask themselves later. And yeah, I definitely, I hear what you're saying, but I think that there's also, we need to balance the potential benefits of people signing the reviews against the very real fear of retribution that I think, especially early career researchers or people who feel or are underrepresented or marginalized in academia. And I think that it would be challenging if we excluded more of those people who I think we should be doing more of the review than they currently are, from being part of the conversation.
Should you, I mean, I'm wondering, like, should reviews be, should you be allowed to, it's interesting, like, if once it's public, it just really kind of changes in some sense what it is. I mean, obviously, if it's, the standard model right now, it does have that kind of finality of decision because, you influence the editor and that kind of stuff. But it seems to me that it's kind of, there's a different kind of finality to it once the peer review comment is out there and it's public, especially even, I mean, you could be just wrong because you don't understand something. Or maybe even worse, you could be wrong because you don't understand something and then you realize a year later, oops, I didn't understand it and you want to correct it. So should you be allowed to like comment on your own reviews, or how do you deal with kind of, bad peer review that's then, I mean, that's one of the classic fears, right? That you kind of attach this incorrect and negative potential perspective to an article forever, right?
Yeah. And Absolutely. And I mean, that is happening now in the current journal system, but it's not necessarily being revealed. So you may have inadvertently, for example, by, in the case you present, let's say that there's a viewer who misunderstands something about the paper, their review could certainly impact the outcome of that paper, whether that paper is published or not. But I think the benefit of bringing the review into the open is that there is this, I guess what we would call, in the United States, like bystander training, where, you as a third party who is able to view something happening, you have an opportunity to kind of step in and say, I really agree with this. I disagree with this. Here's a different way of looking at it. So by broadening that pool of expertise, I think that we collectively could potentially get to more accurate assessments or more fair assessments faster. Now, I think you also touched on this idea, well, if I publish something, then I'm going to be wrong, on the internet.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, that is a horrifying idea. Like, I completely agree with you. But
I mean, it's basically like the peer review equivalent of seeing your old Facebook post from when you were 15 or something, right?
Yeah. No. Yeah, exactly. Right. It to some extent, like that is something that we as a culture are probably, running into in a variety of different ways, both personally and professionally, like these ghosts of the past coming out. But I do think that there's something really sensitive here about notions of what goes in the literature and whether things that are in the literature, we've been talking about earlier in the hour how when something is published, people tend to sort of trust it, right? Even though that might not necessarily be fully warranted. Like there might be parts of a paper that are later disputed, but we don't really have the granularity to say like exactly this is not necessarily something that everyone believes anymore, or we're moving from a super oversimplified way of validating or certifying information into an environment where there's a lot more openness and a lot more richness of information, but also perhaps less control. And so I think that we can learn something from social networks. Like, so for example, Twitter has inserted these context cards under tweets that are controversial, where I believe that they're actually written by other community members who want to provide important context. And so by kind of highlighting some of that information and presenting it to people alongside, I think that that's one way that we can help to create a more nuanced approximation of the truth. So I think in life sciences or in biology right now, there's papers, of course, that have been retracted, but other papers that I think, they're not necessarily wrong, but perhaps the field has changed the way that they think about things. And that is not something that I think implies that the work was done without care or rigor, but it would benefit everyone if we were able to have more context about how thinking in the field has changed over time.
Yeah, I guess especially for outsiders of the field, right? I mean, I guess that happens quite often that you're like, oh, here's this like really highly cited paper from this one field. Yeah. And then you find out, oh, they've moved on. That's like,
exactly.
That was outdated 10 years ago. Yeah.
Right. And you would know that like just by speaking to someone if you had the right connections.
Yeah,
or,
if you were from the field or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. The information is inside many people's brains, but it's just not really expressed and shared in a way that enables everyone to have access to that information.
Okay. So, I mean, we've talked about like a bunch of different ways in which, some things work, some things don't work, and this kind of stuff, and how we might want to improve things or what aspects we might want to incorporate in some form. One question I kind of have is there anything we can do as like individual scientists? Or, I mean, we can maybe do something like you're doing and do it full time. But for people who, don't want to stay scientists, like, is there anything you can actually do about this kind of stuff yourself? Or is it kind of just, you hope that the norms change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a variety of different actions that individual researchers could take, ranging from the mild to the much more intense. So, for example, I think one simple thing to do is to simply watch preprints and look for peer review, look for comments or feedback. For example, in certain preprint servers on bioRxiv, there's not only the comments section, but also a panel where you can pull out and link out to different forms of review. So that might not be something that is front and center on everyone's mind, but I think being aware, looking for those, bringing them up in conversation, I think a huge vehicle for an opportunity for normalizing the use of preprints and actually highlighting the benefits of preprints is in journal clubs. So at least when I went to grad school, journal clubs were a way to demonstrate how smart you are by trashing a published paper, and then nothing is done with the discussion. But if instead a group of grad students or really lab members or whoever were to discuss a recent preprint in their field, they could write up their comments and send those comments to the author, or even better, post them publicly on the preprint to help influence that work and to grow connections within their field. I think that it's just a much more constructive use of time, in my opinion. Yeah, and I think that for someone who is looking for more, ASAPbio, we run a fellows program, which is essentially like a 6-month program where early career researchers will get some exposure to kind of the research about preprints, the meta research about preprints, some opportunity to practice kind of advocacy and discussing preprints, and also work on projects relating to preprints too. So that is something that I think might be an opportunity for somebody who's looking to kind of be more of a champion locally in their local environment, their institution, or their society, and try to get some change happening.
Okay. I asked my last question for people who kind of want to stay in kind of traditional academia, science, that kind of stuff. What if basically how you've been, taking a, much more, not an extreme more position, but, you work on this full time. I'm curious kind of how that happened in your particular case, and maybe also what kind of other jobs like this are out there. Was ASAPbio the first job like this that you did, or did you have something else before, and kind of how did you get there?
ASAPbio is something that I started working on during my postdoc. But prior to this, I was involved in another organization, and actually a couple other organizations relating to kind of scientific workforce, looking at incentives in the scientific enterprise. And that, really began during my postdoc, kind of looking around. I was at an institution where, I felt like there was a lot of competition among researchers. There was a sense of urgency and kind of, a sense that one had to optimize your science for publication, not necessarily for doing the science, if that makes sense. Yeah. And, if you think about it, like, what are we being rewarded for doing? What is all of the kind of funding and institutional structures supporting? What kind of behaviors are they? And I'm not sure that they're really the behaviors that we most want to see among researchers, which I would argue include things like collaboration, being, a very supportive mentor, sharing, openness, all those things. Even rigor, I would argue, is not really immediately rewarded in the same way that telling a good story about a selection of your work that happens to fit together, that the rest of which will be buried in like a file drawer. I think that there's a variety of different kind of challenges that became more obvious to me once I emerged from the cocoon of a PhD program into seeing, more how people were competing for academic jobs and funding. So I originally started working with some postdocs in the Boston area because there's a huge concentration of postdocs around Boston, and we put together a meeting about the research enterprise, which I think relates to ideas of how do these incentives impact a population that is experiencing a high level of competition, which is possibly a result of the fact that the biomedical research workforce relies on training as its primary labor force. It's not as though there's a professionalized labor source. The labor source is really trainees who are, expected to go out and leave the system and do something else, but at the same time creates this real sense of urgency and it's been called hyper competition, which I do agree with. So I started working on preprints when Ron Vale, who was a professor at my PhD institution, recruited some people that he knew, being interested in the space, Harold Varmus and Daniel Colin Ramos, also among them. And so ASAPbio was not originally intended to be an organization. It was simply a meeting. But at this meeting, there was interest from funders in advancing the program, and it grew from there to into a nonprofit. So I was very fortunate to have this opportunity that I think was created out of this sort of extracurricular hobby that was started really by people within academia. So I do think that there's an opportunity for people to do a lot of interesting things within academia, though I will acknowledge, again, the incentives are not necessarily supportive of trying to change the rules of the game that you're playing while playing the game. So, I think that was a big factor in, ultimately what interests me more, the bench work that I was doing, and I of course loved, but or trying to affect these issues, which could potentially have a broader impact if successful. And so I think that, for me, I was really fortunate to have that opportunity, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for people who are interested in working in that space. I probably, a really compelling alternative would be policy fellowships, which I know certainly in the United States, there are several of these things that enable early career people to spend time working in government or other agencies. I think that would be also a really good path for people who are thinking more broadly.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do all day? What is your, on a practical level, what does that kind of work involve?
Yeah. So I think what's kind of fun about this is that, as a small organization, there's only 2 full-time staff people at ASAPbio. And so I end up doing quite a lot of different things that I am certainly not a master of any of these trades, but everything from sort of accounting to communications, updating the website, logistics, things like that. But really, there's a lot of emailing and a lot of Zoom calls, organizing working groups, planning meetings, writing, editing, and I think trying to organize various campaigns and really talk to others and integrate their input into best practice recommendations or opinion pieces, etc. So I think that there's a large variety, and that's in a sense probably the most exciting and best part about this. We have a great board who are, I think, very willing to, think outside the box, but also keep us a bit grounded in what's going to be functional and productive for researchers who are kind of living in the reality of academia on a day-to-day basis. So, I'm very grateful for that. But it is a lot of being like a disembodied presence in front of a computer. And I found that when I moved from bench work to this, that I was really actually missing like pipetting, which might sound like
you can buy a pipette.
Pipetting is, yeah, there you go. Okay. You just solved all my problems. Yeah.
I mean,
right. I think that, yeah. Yeah. So, right. I do work from home, which I think is, also like a big change as well. But yeah, on the whole, there's a lot of flexibility.
Okay. Do you, I mean, like all jokes aside, do you actually do something to kind of scratch the itch of like not, that you can't do this kind of like bench work now? Do you do something else for that? Or is it just like just a dream you have to...
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think that probably the closest thing that I do to approximate that is recreational microscopy, and specifically bringing microscopy and projected microscopy into environments where it's not necessarily like expected.
Sorry, what's projective microscopy?
So I'm sorry, taking a microscope and hooking it up to a projector.
Okay.
And so instead of people, I do think there is something very magical about looking through some eyepieces, but basically treating a microscope as like a source of audiovisual enjoyment and entertainment. So, for example, my partner and I last New Year's projected microscopy at a essentially like electronic music show at a science museum in Florida, which was a lot of fun. So, it's things like that where there's still, it's not just pipetting. It's not just the physical aspect. It's also just the sense of awe at looking at life, and something about looking at like a single cell, I think really brings that out, that you're getting close to this level where you can kind of look at it as a living thing, but you can also see it as a machine. And that is, I think, really kind of an exciting interface for me.
That's really cool. Yeah. I mean, I've done a few episodes about kind of people who try and combine like art and neuroscience. It sounds like you're, without even knowing, like I didn't know this before and that you did this. It sounds like you're also doing a little bit of that.
Yeah, well, I'd love to do more. It's it's a lot of fun.
Quick question for people who are kind of interested in doing this thing, maybe starting something themselves. I mean, obviously you don't have to have any funding in the beginning, but I'm just curious. Yeah, I think you mentioned that, at some point ASAPbio started getting some funding, that kind of stuff. How does that kind of process work? Do you just go to like random charities, like scientific charities, and or are there calls for this stuff? How does it work?
Yeah, that's such a good. There's such a good question. I think that for us, we were very fortunate because we were sort of talking to funders anyway, because their reaction to preprints is incredibly important for the adoption of preprints. And so I think that we were able to engage the funders from this point of view of, let's have a conversation about how we collectively are going to work on this problem together. And then I think that the opportunity for funding sort of emerged a bit from that. But as far as whether there are calls, I think that the most significant thing that I'm aware of is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative does have an open science program that does give grants. And I think that would definitely be something to look into for people who are interested in that space.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, at the end of each interview, I have 3 current questions that I'll ask each guest. First one is, what's a book or paper that you think more people should read? This can be old, new, famous, completely unknown, just something that you like and think more people should read.
Maybe this is already ubiquitously read by children everywhere, but I definitely had an amazing experience reading Flatland from Edwin Abbott, which was authored in like 1884 as a child. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember being my mind just being completely blown by the concept of perception not being equivalent to reality. And I think that maybe a more practical recommendation for people who are thinking about trying to change culture is Influence from Robert Cialdini, which is a book about persuasion and the psychology of persuasion, written in 1993 originally, I believe, and updated since. And I think that that book has been incredibly practically useful. I realize I sound, Machiavellian here because on one level, I don't want to be taking advantage or distorting anyone's decisions in a way that is not constructive and not without their consent. But I do think that encountering the principles that are in this book and understanding how people are making decisions is illuminating, not only into looking into your own behavior, but also thinking about why some of these changes, why certain things are just so recalcitrant, and why it's so difficult to change culture in the first place. Like, for example, there's this emphasis in there about consensus being a huge factor in decision making, and like what are other people around you doing, and what is sort of the accepted practice, and that's something that anybody who wants to make change is going to be running up against. And so, thinking about, again, it's changing the perspective of a scientist or a human from a logical entity into a imperfectly perceiving primate. And I think that's really useful when looking at how to communicate, but also just looking at my own behavior and decisions. It's helpful to be aware of these things.
Yeah, I did not. I think it's funny. I think you've given like the most psychological recommendation so far on the show, even though you're probably the furthest away from it from the people I've interviewed. So that was kind of, I didn't expect that.
That's
yes, actually, for once, a book I've actually read before, which is nice. But I haven't read Flatlands yet.
Oh, it's so fun.
Yeah, someone recommended it to me, and then I didn't act on it. But yeah. The second question is something you wish you'd learned sooner. This can be from your work life or your private life, just something that you think might have improved your life a little bit, and maybe also how you learned it or what you did about it.
Yeah, I think that it relates to what we talked about earlier about leaving academia. And I think I would express it maybe as that you can have multiple identities that coexist, and that goals and aspirations and values can change over time. I think I really struggled during my postdoc with the decision of whether to continue along this path toward academia. And I do really, I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to do something that I'm really passionate about. But I still struggled with the idea of giving up this identity of, of being a scientist, right? And it's, I think there's a lot of pressures in society. I'm thinking back to like writing college admissions essays, or as a scientist or as a researcher, I went to even like workshops about like branding as a scientist. The idea that you create this cohesive sense of identity around who you are and what you're doing. But that that can also become very constrictive when you try to imagine other futures and other possibilities. And so I do think that everyone contains multitudes, so to speak. And I think that if I had understood that a little bit earlier, and not just on an academic level, like, of course, I think it's obvious that there's I think everyone will agree that going outside of changing plans is like a reasonable thing to do, but it's one thing to say that versus to actually live it and execute it.
Yeah, and to realize that it applies to you, not just to other people. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, my final question, maybe you've already kind of answered it partially, I don't know. But the final question is always any advice for people who are kind of PhD student postdocs, or particularly people at that transitionary period?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know. I think that maybe this could have been an artifact of the particular way that I went through academia, but I don't really feel that outside of writing fellowship applications, there was a lot of structured planning. So I think that there certainly are individual development plans and things like that I think are becoming much more widely used. But I think one thing that I have only realized after leaving academia and moving into another environment, which is also unstructured, but I think there's more of a pressure to actually impose and create structure, is sort of the value of like deliberately planning and trying to think on a time scale that works for you. For example, I've always found like annual planning to be just like too long for my puny attention span. But I've recently become a fan of quarterly planning, and specifically the 12-week year as kind of a framework of thinking about what I'm doing on a weekly basis in order to achieve these larger goals.
Wait, that's a book,
so,
right?
I don't know.
Isn't there a book with that?
It's a book. It's a book. And I think it's, I would say that some of it in the book really wouldn't be challenging to translate into an environment which is highly variable, where, I think, but the simple principle, if I could just express it, is like, you come up with a plan, like a quarterly plan, and then plan what you're going to do every week to achieve the quarterly goal, and then literally check in every week, right? And that's not like a brilliant, crazy revelation that nobody could have thought of before. But I do think that this weekly cadence is like, there's something, I think it's important to connect like weekly to quarterly to broader goals. And then, I think I was very fortunate to have some opportunity to have time to explore different things in my postdoc. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in thinking about perhaps moving outside of a traditional academic career to also find a way to do that in a way that also enables you to progress within the lab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that those are all my questions. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. Nice to chat with you.